We are live, coming to you from all over the world with a Pirate Live special. My name is Miles Whiticker, Party President of Pirate Party Australia. With me is Mitch Davilo, US congressional candidate for Illinois and swarmcare manager of Pirate Party US, or US Pirate Party. Always gets me every time. Every single party around the world always puts the words in a different order. And so I'm going to call you Pirate Party US for the rest of tonight. I apologize in advance. So, Mitch, how about you introduce yourself? Because I think everyone, all of you, is probably pretty familiar with me already.
Sure thing. So I am Mitch Davilo. I am the sole congressional candidate for the United States Pirate Party. I am the swarmcare manager. My responsibilities are simply to welcome in activists, make sure they feel included into the swarm. I've been helping get state parties running in the United States Pirate Party. I myself am the chair of the Illinois State Party. Since I've been here, we've also gotten, California has become an officially recognized state. That is actually Rosa's state, who she's not here at the moment. I'm sure they'll be joining us as soon as they can. We have Indiana on the way, and we're hoping to continue to grow statewide. I myself, I'm happy to be a part of it.
Really exciting to hear those plans for expansion. So we've got there's so many different topics we want to go through. You and I were swapping emails for months, and we jumped into those meetings together and we're chatting, a few of your members, a few of our members, and we just we couldn't stop. There's just so many things that we have overlaps. It's like this natural policy area where so much of Australian domestic policy and Australian foreign policy as well is dominated by US interests. And similarly with the US and Australia, various treaties, free trade and security and so on and so forth over the years, which we'll get more into later, it seems like a lot of Australian policy is likewise feeding back into America, both culturally as well as diplomatically, security, economy, and so on and so forth. So it seems like we should be doing this years ago, right from the start.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we have, in our many conversations, we've said it before, but if I'm not mistaken, we are the last Anglophone, English-speaking pirate parties left. I believe UK folded, Canada folded, and New Zealand is, to my understanding, folded as well. So we, as countries with similar histories, similar cultures, and as you said, very similar foreign and domestic policies, it only makes sense that we finally have the chance to work together, to collaborate, to kind of bring our two parties closer together.
Exactly. Yeah, and I remember when the UK party decided to give it up, they'd had one last election, gave it a good strong go, and Topper Falcon, I think his name was, their last. I think they have a pirate captain was their old title. Yep, he ran a pretty strong campaign for one of their seats. He did fairly well. It got me like 9% or 7%, I think, for his run, but I know he's still around. He's on our Discord. He jumps in to say hi occasionally. He's got a couple of other Discords as well, jumping into chat. Similar with Pirate Party New Zealand, I know there's a few old faces which are still saying around, saying hi. The Internet Party of New Zealand, as endorsed by Kim.com himself, is the successor to the New Zealand Pirate Party legacy, having been admitted to Pirate Party International and is actively contesting elections over there, which is very exciting. And obviously we ideologically we align and support with a lot of what's going on with Kim.com and Mega Upload, allegations of criminal activity notwithstanding. And obviously in Pirate Party Canada, the home of the current chair of Pirate Party International, Bailey Lamont, and doing some very exciting things, coordinating across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe and the US. So even though those parties have officially folded, we know that there is still very much pirate politics ongoing and active within, as you said, the Anglophone countries. So let's sort of wind back a little bit. How exactly did the US Pirate Party start? Because I have a feeling there might be a few little similarities between our two founding origins.
So it was my understanding the United States Pirate Party is actually the second pirate party to form. You would think that would come from, it would start in Europe, spread in Europe, and then, across the Atlantic, but the United States happened to be number two. I believe it was two college students from Georgia at the time, and it has since expanded into a 16 year, 15 year now of just pirate politics throughout this country. And third parties in this country, it is a very difficult thing to grow, as evidenced by the largest third party in this country only recently, was a contender. And even then, they didn't win any states. That was, 5 years ago during the Trump election, the first one. We are a country as big as continental Europe. So it's been difficult for the United States to form. It would be the equivalent of Pirate Party Europe forming first and then saying, all right, guys, let's get these pirate parties started. So while the process has been slow, I've been very impressed with seeing how the Pirate Party has gotten this far and, maintaining a sense of relevance and name value, even with only one elected pirate in the country throughout its history, Steve from Massachusetts. So I think the 2020s moving forward, we are going to see a stronger push for pirate politics in the United States. I think that historically speaking, we faced the same challenges many third parties have faced. But I do believe pirate politics offers something different. I think that it's more than a niche European ideology. I think that, just this live stream here where we have the United States and Australia, we have now multi-continental pirate parties showing success and showing improvement, showing that we are trying and to make a difference in our countries. But yeah, that's how the United States party started, and that's why we are still in the position we are in, I would say. Many ups and downs, but we're moving.
There's that whole question, right? And we get asked continuously, and I have no doubt you'd probably hit it time again too. It's the old question: why do you pick the name Pirate Party? Why do you think you'll get any success if people are just going to keep looking at you and think, oh, that's a joke party? I don't think you'll get any success using that name. And our standard answer is that, well, like look at Europe and look at the massive success that pirate politics has had over there in transforming the direction of politics across Europe and within European countries as well. Without a doubt, they've had multiple members elected and they've come close to forming government or have outright formed government in multiple countries as well. So we can point to that and say, yes, no, it is a successful and massive international movement. It's got a clear, strong platform, which is highly appealing to a not insignificant demographic. But then talking strategically, where do we go beyond that? Like even for those who are aware of us and do follow and support our politics, it's still always going to be a niche demographic. So an observation I made was that of all the successful pirate parties in Europe, 3 out of 4 of them have all been in coalitions. Pirate Party Czechia, Pirate Party Iceland, and Pirate Party Europe. They're all in coalitions. And that's how they've managed to get over that edge, to get additional members elected and much broader, more mainstream support. So I think it's kind of a natural area that the pirates, with our specific subject matter expertise in, and we'll get more into this later, in pushbacks against surveillance overreach, in spying, in the war against terror and so-called counterterrorism, in support of evidence-based policy and in fighting against rent-seeking, and in support of civil liberties, transparency, openness, all of these pirate values, which we all hold in common, even though we do have, in some cases, very significant regional differences. So let's kind of drill into that a little bit more, because, as I mentioned earlier, we've got such a big, there are so many overlaps between our national policy and our foreign policy that it's something that really needs to be addressed in both of our platforms. And so, I think the thing which everyone is really talking about at the moment is the new AUKUS pact, the Trilateral Security Pact, Australia, UK, and the US. It's yet another continuation of these sort of post NATO, post Cold War security pacts, where in many cases this is the successor of Kansas or Kansas or whatever it was, and before that it was at one point it was Anzac, and we still have that as a big part of our sort of national memory. So what I'm dying to know is what are Americans saying about Australia at the moment in terms of these international security pacts? What are Americans saying about the submarine deal? What are Americans saying about China?
Well, I can honestly tell you that the consensus with most US citizens would be pretty 50-50 on China. I think that there is a pretty heavy distrust, and that's probably a lot greater number than 50-50. But I think that the country being so divided as it is right now, you have a portion of the country where China is the devil. China can do no right. China has, caused everything wrong in the last 2 years. And then there's other portions of this country that will argue the United States has been the problem of the last 100 years. And, when looking at the AUKUS, to me, it feels like not a post Cold War, but a continuation of it. The amount of military bases that the United States has across the world, not just in Australia, it's very imperial. The United States is an empire by all intents and purposes. And I know me personally, I do find the AUKUS deal to be a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? It feels like an anti-Chinese pact, and ultimately, I understand the need to counter influence or the desire to, especially with military strategy. But militarily, I don't believe the United States' interest is always vested in best intent.
It's a difficult one here in Australia as well, and the opinion on the left here is absolutely split down the middle. We've got two big camps. There's the I want to say neoliberal mainstream left, particularly dominated by the Australian Labor Party, the left-wing opposition party of government here, who are broadly, I want to say, supportive of being friendly and having positive trade relations with China, positive diplomatic relations with China. And then you have elements within the Liberal National Party who also similarly want to maintain positive and friendly relations. But then you have factions in the Liberal Party as well as maverick left-wing radical factions who are like, no, hang on a second, there's some real problems here with what China's doing, and we should actually actively work to try and mitigate that or address that. And then you have the another very significant fact of left-wingers from all variety of ideologies united together that are broadly defensive of China and critical of the Australian-US alliance, saying that China is just reacting defensively towards US and Australian aggression in the region. And it's something that is largely split down ideological lines because a lot of people throw around the word racism, but in the case of the right-wing conservatives, a lot of their suspicion and skepticism towards China's foreign policy is quite clearly rooted in nationalism, which obviously has racist implications. But for many of the other people in the center on the left critical or skeptical of Chinese diplomatic intentions, then we have to say, yes, there are some concerns here. And the thing which keeps getting brought up again and again and again is, why is China building artificial islands in the middle of the all across Southeast Asia, and then using those to assert territorial claims? Because you can say that someone is acting defensively if they employ self-defense and arm themselves, and yes, well, there's an argument that they could be acting defensively. But if it gets to a point where they're like, okay, well, I'm going through this massive arms build-up, I'm building this massive army, and China is the biggest the biggest defense spender in the world after the US and has been for quite a long time. Not only that, but they're also building army bases all across Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And additionally, they're actively imperialist in the South China Sea with these artificial islands, with their aggression towards Taiwan, their attempt to assert legal and administrative control over Hong Kong, and obviously the invasion of Tibet 101 years ago now, approximately. You can't really look at that and say, well, in the 1920s when China invaded Tibet, was that prompted by concern over U.S. activity in the region? It just didn't really follow that kind of argument. So we've got to look at this with a nuanced kind of lens and say, well, yeah, absolutely, the U.S. has been imperialist in a lot of ways, and so has Australia. You only have to look at the Pine Gap base here in the Northern Territory, where I'm told allegedly there is a room on the base where no one with an Australian citizen is allowed to enter. Only US defense personnel and high level personnel are allowed into this so called dark room, and only they have knowledge of what's going on in there. That's a rumor, and that's absolutely unverified. But we do know, and we're fairly confident that the activities within the Pine Gap base are involved in various forms of defense activities, such as drone monitoring across large parts of the southern hemisphere, as well as coordinating various defensive operations such as Talisman Sabre and so on and so forth throughout the region. And that's been going on for a very long time, for over a decade, possibly decades. But obviously, US and Australian defense cooperation stretches all the way back to World War II. And even then, in some ways, it seemed like kind of a one-sided relationship. But I think we in Australia, the Australian pirates, don't have a strong position either way. Typically, we are skeptical of Chinese imperialism, and but equally, we'll also criticize Australian and American imperialism and the very, very closey relationship between the US and between Australia. We just have to make it clear that we criticize problematic behavior where we see it, and we seek to remedy that where we see it. And while we can absolutely affect Australian domestic policy, what can we in Australia do about this brinkmanship between the US and China? We're a small player in the region, and our only value is in our, speaking geopolitics now, is in our large mineral reserves and our position in Southeast Asia and Oceania.
Yes, and I do agree. I think it's important to just specify that just because we call out the imperial nature of our own countries, that we suddenly have to take the position that the other country they've done no wrong. China has been just as imperial, has been just as much enforcing the will of an empire. It just so happens it's a communist empire. And I don't think that makes any difference in the eyes of imperialism. To your point, the way that they have erased Tibetan culture disgusts me. The same way that any nation erasing any other nation's culture and saying, no, you're assimilating. That I can't stand by that. So there's plenty to criticize China over. It's just the AUKUS defense pact is one that I'm not sure I'm willing to criticize China over, because it just seems to me, like I said before, a continuation of Cold War narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's other aspects to this as well, which we sometimes forget, and it's something that overseas you would totally miss, but here in Australia you do see clear evidence here and there, is that it's not just this military aggression, but China's absolutely engaging in diplomatic and economic forms of foreign policy influencing in Australia, I want to say, to be polite. And it's expressing itself in some fairly obscure ways. Like there was a council down in Victoria, I think it was Mornington Council, or no, it was an inland one, in somewhere along the east coast, and they had a what was it? It was a Chinese New Year festival, and there was a local Taiwan Friends of Taiwan organization, who are actually putting on a performance as part of this Chinese New Year festival. And there was this massive campaign by mainland Chinese PRC diplomats to pressure this tiny little council to actually blacklist that Taiwanese group, to stop all promotions, to remove them from the kick them from the festival. This utterly bizarre, massive amount of diplomatic weight brought to bear in this tiny little regional council just over them, wanting to support and promote the culture of this valuable neighbor, this valuable trading partner. And another way as well, which we've seen much more prominently, is all the talk about Chinese influence in universities over here, where there's been a huge amount of drama over the last few years about something called the Ramsey Institute, which is fairly notorious amongst various left-wing advocates. The Ramsey Center is obviously a privately funded think tank aiming to set up various teaching centers and universities around the world. There's quite a few in America, some in the UK, and some in Australia as well. And the goal of the Ramsey Center is to promote Western studies, and this is being classed as being actively racist and actively harmful by many left-wing academics. And so it's this huge fight in the culture wars, and yet at the same time there was the Chinese state-funded program called the Confucius Institute to do exactly the same in universities all around the world, but with the explicit goal of promoting Han Chinese studies and Mandarin language studies as well. And so, whereas in the Ramsey Center they were teaching things like European art and music and continental philosophy, which are all valid areas of study in many of the Haas faculty areas and already taught in many universities in different areas. And similarly, Mandarin language and aspects of Asian studies, of Han Chinese cultural studies, is also similarly taught in many areas. But there was no comparable outcry from radical left-wing activists against the Confucius Institute until just over the last few years, when there started to be some pushback from a weird kind of alt-centrist left coalition who I've actually had some affiliation with, and I've actually known and met and talked to a number of these activists. Most prominent among them is a young philosophy major called Drew Pavlou from Brisbane, who's organized massive rallies and protests against Chinese state influence in universities through this Confucius Institute. And what has happened at these rallies, which were otherwise fairly innocuous and calling for skepticism of government and academic policies, which is increasingly catering to foreign money simply at the expense of domestic students, simply as a way to raise revenue. And at these protests, there were agents of the Chinese government. There was huge amounts of Han Chinese students turning up to counter-protest. When Drew was assaulted at some of these rallies, they turned violent, and the university persecuted him actively for organizing these protests in an attempt to, like this tiny council in regional Victoria, in an attempt to get on the good side of Chinese foreign policy advocates, to get on the good side of the Chinese state, and to keep attracting Chinese investment money and Chinese students as a way to boost revenue. So that's something you would never hear about or never see unless you're actively here and involved and seeing day-to-day life. And I know in America there has also been Ramsey Centers and Confucius Institutes. Are you familiar with what's going on over there?
I am actually not familiar. This is the first time I've heard of the Ramsey Center or Institute. If it is prevalent in America or the Americas or the United States, I am very unfamiliar with it. I have to be totally honest with you. And that, I don't know if that has anything to do with geographically how close Australia is to China, to where the sphere of influence might just happen to be greater, or if I'm just totally oblivious, which is, I suppose, just as possible. But this is the first I'm hearing anything of the Ramsey Center, and it's a very interesting point when you bring up the dichotomy of the push of the Western culture being racist versus the push of the Confucius, Han Chinese, here's Mandarin language culture. Because again, I don't know if I appreciate countries trying to push their influence into other countries under any circumstances. So to see a state funding that push of their culture like that. It is bothersome to me. I wouldn't appreciate knowing the United States was funneling the same type of programs in China. That would make me very upset. So having it, reversed
Mm.
doesn't make it any better to me.
And to clarify, we have absolutely no problem with cherishing and teaching and promoting aspects of culture and language and history and philosophy, because that's all really important. That has to be cherished. But at the same time, we've still got to wonder whether there's an element of blatant nationalism or raw nationalism behind some of these pushes, and whether that does sometimes veer into a little bit of racism. So speaking of domestic policy, then there's been some enormous protests over in the U.S. at the start of this year and the end of last year with the Black Lives Matter protest, and it was absolutely shocking. For over a series of weeks, we saw half of America descend into these enormous riots, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people hitting the streets, and the police similarly deploying enormous militarized resources to try and shut these down, shut these protests, in some case rioters down. What was your perspective on that? What did you see on the ground?
Well, I live in the city of Chicago, personally, so I got to be front and center in uh, where a lot of this was taking place. Chicago being the third largest city in the United States, we have a heavy black population. I myself live on the south side of Chicago, where most of the black community lives in the city. So for me, uh, it's the I want to say the day that the George Floyd video came out, there was an eruption of protests, and there were police officers in the streets in riot gear, ready to maintain peace or keep the peace. Or it it was chaotic, but the one thing that I took away from it was the how much more seriously this country takes threats from the left than it does the right. Uh, Mostly because the Black Lives Matter protests typically were a left wing, if not exclusively left wing, protest and movement. You didn't see, and not for any racial connotations, I would say, but you didn't see many conservatives, no many Republicans taking part in Black Lives Matter protests. A lot of them leaning more towards in the All Lives Matter field.
And yet here in Australia, we saw right libertarians turning up at BLM protests. Not many, I'll grant you, but I'll give a special shout out to Liberal Democrat members David Limbrick, and I think Senator Rex Patrick was turning up to some as well down in Victoria, New South Wales, when almost very few people on the right identifying as libertarians would turn up to these protests. We did see Liberal Democrat members turning up to support their right to protest and their support to free speech. Sorry, I just wanted to add that point, but go on.
No, absolutely. And the protests, they were rough, but I think that the thing that was exemplified the most, again, it was more so not just the left, the violence of threats from the left, or the threat of violence from the left is taken more seriously. But there were cases, I'm not sure if the name Kyle Rittenhouse means anything, but he was a young man from Illinois, my state, who drove up to Wisconsin during Milwaukee rioting, and he had shot two people and was allowed to just go home. I'm pretty sure the officer like fist bumped him while strapping an AK on his back, and left, or AR rather. Uh, the A guy like Kyle Rittenhouse should have been arrested immediately. He was 17. He wasn't from the state. He couldn't carry a gun because he was a minor. But he was on the side of the police, so he was given a pass. Because ultimately, these protests became pro-police versus anti-police, more so than it became equality for African Americans. Which, on one hand, is a shame because it did kind of make it more divisive. But on the other hand, the problems that many Black Americans face does stem from the United States institution of how we run the police officer, or of how we run law enforcement in this country. So the protests themselves were bad, definitely handled far stricter than the January 6th insurrection,
Hmm.
which was you talk
This
that again. That's why I say the left's threats were taken far more seriously.
Hmm.
The,
And the
the
imagery from that was absolutely incredible. I saw one image going around of it was how it started with the Trump presidency, and there was the massive banners and the huge rallies he had in front of the White House, and then how it's going was the photo with flames all over the White House, people scaling the walls, this massive riotous crowd in front of it, police in riot gear, walking around everywhere. It was absolutely incredible dichotomy, and this siege that was going on, this actual siege of the White House, how the doors and walls were barricaded, and you had protesters beating them down, and special service or secret service, whatever you call it, with guns drawn at the windows and doors, ready to protect all of your elected members. It was absolutely incredible that anything like that could happen. Coming and just this short time, whatever it was, 9 months after the BLM protests as well, where it literally looked like these riots were going to spread, and these protests were going to spread and encompass half or two-thirds of America. It really looks absolutely like an empire in decline. Like the U.S. was absolutely starting to tear itself apart.
and it definitely, I don't want to say that was the start of it, but if anyone had any doubts, I think that that was the telltale sign that we are in fact an empire in decline. I think that the the insurrection, the thing with it is it would have been a valuable opportunity for a lot of these politicians, a lot of these Republicans to say, okay, this has gone too far. It was great having Trump while he was winning, but now, he's lost the election. We can't sacrifice democracy in this country. Instead, you had many politicians like Matt Gaetz who came out and said, actually, I think that was Antifa that just bum rushed the Capitol building. That wasn't Trump supporters. You had Lauren Bobbitt, I believe her name is, who the day before tweeted, "Tomorrow is 1776," which means that a lot of these people knew what was going to happen or had some type of inner workings of what was going to happen. So it's, I don't know if the event itself was going to drive more division into this country, more so than it was going to further display to the rest of the world the division this country is facing.
So then, tell me, where does the US Pirate Party sit in here? What is your vision for the future, and how do you propose pirate politics to begin to move forward from this situation?
Well, there's a lot of things with the. I don't want to speak on behalf of the United States Pirate Party on this one because I feel like something so big should be a platform discussed with all members. However, when I look at it, something that I typically discuss, uh, the first thing that I want to do is remove the label of American to just mean from the United States. I think one of the worst things our empire has done, and in terms of a long term psychological effect, was make an entire group of people within a borders of a country believe that they are the only Americans. Where Europeans are from Europe, Africans are from Africa, Asians are from Asia, but Americans are only from the United States, even though the entire continent is the Americas. Uh, we are a nation of Texans, of Californians, of New Englanders, and I
40 or
think
50 different countries.
we are 50 different countries. Ultimately, it is 50 unique countries under one federal government. Uh, and at some point, I really want someone to say a conservative from New England and a progressive from New England will agree on what's best for New England before a conservative from New England and a progressive from California will agree on what's best for the United States. The way the US was initially set up was a lot more similar to the European Union, to where the commander in chief was quite literally the commander in chief of the joint armed forces. Uh, and part of me believes that maybe if the United States had divulges a bit. I think that God, we're too big. It's not a sustainable empire, and I think that it's slowly coming to that realization. I think it doesn't need to come to a violent or bloody end. The fact that the USSR came to a relatively peaceful dissolution is perhaps one of the most amazing things in history, all things considered.
You're talking about glasnost and perestroika, the liberalizing and the opening up of Soviet domestic policy, the breakup of the Soviet Federal Republic, the introduction of broadly capitalist reforms, liberal democratic reforms, and so on.
Yes, and even more specifically, the end of the Union itself. Uh, in 1991, when it finally did break apart, Christmas Day, it was a relatively clean break. These countries that were coming off, they became their independent countries. And I'm not saying the United States should break off into multiple countries like the USSR did. I'm simply stating that the United States, being as big as it was and as diverse as it was, breaking up peacefully and being able to divulge itself peacefully is something the United States should look forward to. Simply because with the division that this country is facing, I'm not sure a peaceful end is obtainable without planning for it for much longer.
Yeah, scary thought, but the future is a scary place. There's an old Chinese proverb that we live in interesting times, and it's meant as both a blessing and a curse in the sense that may you live in interesting times, may interesting and ominous things occur to you, as this old curse went. Let's wind back slightly. At this, the Black Lives Matter protests happened all over America, and they were rolling on for months. And there was sympathy protests all around the world. Here in Australia, there was similar enormous protests as well, all across the East Coast in the major cities. And they're obviously over here protesting the racist or discriminate treatment of our First Nations peoples, who have some of the worst economic and health-related outcomes in the world out of any ethnic minority group in their own home. And they've obviously faced over a century of discrimination, displacement, and in some cases genocide. And so there was massive protest here in Australia to along those themes as well. But it happened at almost literally months after the COVID outbreak started to go worldwide, and it blew up massively in Australia just as the lockdowns were just starting, the COVID was starting to spread, and then we had our own Sympathy BLM protests. Similarly, in America, you had your first few cases around the same time, and it took longer in America for the outbreak to really ramp up, but it was definitely happening over there that whole time. So what was the American response? And what was I guess, to make it more personal, what happened in Chicago with COVID, and what have you guys done since then?
So the response from the United States was incredibly, we'll say, lackadaisical. Trump was the president when COVID first hit. So during the Trump presidency, there was a growing case of what Trump says is right and what Trump says is wrong, and you took either position. And when it came to COVID, when Trump said it wasn't a big deal, you'd hear the other side saying it's a massive deal and we need to listen. But very early on, you had someone like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, say, no, everything's fine. Go to Chinatown without a mask on and, live a little, which was racist. So it was very much a don't worry about it. It's not going to affect us. We had a Super Bowl without affecting it. We said, no, go ahead with the Super Bowl, no lockdowns. And then we wrote an article saying, well, thank God the Niners didn't win because COVID would have came sooner. And it's like, I'm glad we're taking it seriously. As such, we're a nation where many adults are not taking the vaccine out of distrust for the government, and that mostly stems not just from the Trump years. It stems from the Obama years. It stems from the Bush years. But COVID, the response has been very shaky in the States. And now specifically for Chicago, Chicago's an interesting place because we essentially have three bosses. We were listening to the president of the United States. We were listening to the governor of Illinois, but then we were listening to our own mayor. And a lot of times they were saying three different things. So Chicago, we faced lockdowns. I work in the food industry. I did not have to deal with any loss of employment, thank God, and I was very lucky for that. But I know a lot of people uh, resorted to working jobs where they were able to find steady employment, such as DoorDash or Postmates, and that's just not. I don't know if I don't know if people quite understand how heavy of a toll it has taken on many employees in the United States. That where a lot of times you'll hear like, "Oh, the job we have a labor shortage," and it's not the case. We have people who are trying to work, but there's no money. People aren't paying, and it does. And when COVID hit, it really amped up that process. We were already facing a lot of financial inequality before, but now with post COVID, they said that inequality in the United States is worse than it was in the Gilded Age. So there's definitely an economic struggle that has come from COVID, which I think is something that gets discussed, but not nearly as much as just the whole vaccine craze of COVID.
I know the New York mayor Rudy Giuliani was wildly popular. He was Republican conservative, but he was extremely popular for a long time, partially for his work as district attorney fighting the mafia bosses way back in the 80s, a bit of ancient history. But he also did a very good job keeping New York City together in the aftermath of the 2001, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And but since then he got a whole lot of criticism for his support of Trump and his legal support in particular, including the Ukraine scandal and joining Trump's defense team. And obviously since then he was strongly anti-mask and implemented anti-mask policies throughout his administration. So if all we're hearing, I mean, America's a huge place, and we get very mixed messages from all over here in Australia. But we're seeing conflicting messages from different states and from different levels of the administration that seems like a really confusing response. And like here in Australia, we only have the 7 states, and honestly, only 3 of those are well populated and have a major influence on domestic policies. That being Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, where most of our population is concentrated on the east coast. But even between these 3 states, there has been policy mismatches and uneven support from the federal government, and a sort of right libertarians call it competitive federalism. I would probably call it petty, trivial squabbling across state borders as these mismatched responses happen. But we really only have the 3 states on the east coast that are kind of one-upping each other, and even then, there is a certain amount of unity. Whereas over in America, you have so much less unity across state lines. Your states' rights it gives them states so much more freedom to go off in weird directions.
Yeah, and like I said, we being as big as continental Europe, like people don't understand just how culturally unique each state is. Like the distance from Los Angeles, California to if you drove from Los Angeles, California to Portland, Maine, it's actually a longer drive than if you drove from Lisbon, Portugal to Moscow, Russia. So, of course, people in Portugal are going to say something different from people in Poland. You know, culturally speaking, they're totally different. Uh, Geographically, they're totally different. They're seeing things, they're seeing the world differently. But we're expected to believe, oh, no, they're just Americans. They're all Americans. They all think the same. The United States is not a blank, this is how everyone is. There's very much, stereotypes of how the middle American is, we'll call them. But I think culturally, you're right. States' rights has played a big culture. It's caused a civil war. States' rights over owning people, but it has caused civil wars. The idea that the president can't tell states what to do. You know.
Hmm. The biggest, well, speaking from Australian perspective, the biggest division in terms of state-based approaches to COVID has to be between New South Wales and Victoria. And it's been in the news a lot recently in Australia, and apparently it's got even so far as Europe and America. There's been a huge fuss about the protest lockdowns, and I don't mean to minimise that, but the for context, Queensland and Victoria and a couple of other states, but on the East Coast, Queensland and Victoria are Labor governments, so they're nominally left wing or left leaning or centre left, and so typically these two states have taken fairly lockdown heavy approaches, lockdown fast and early, and require masks and set up effective and wide scale vaccine programs in urban centres. And New South Wales taking a very different tack, where there's regular press releases from Our Lady Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales, to announce that all is well and the spiralling record numbers of cases are going to start going down tomorrow. Wait, no, tomorrow. No, the day after. Sorry, maybe next week they'll start going down, when meanwhile it was a bit of an exponential curve for a while. And that was the official policy vision from New South Wales, that she'll be right and it'll start improving soon, when it didn't. And she was looking increasingly panicky towards the end there before cutting the press releases entirely. So New South Wales eventually managed to somehow wander around to some minor lockdowns, and and New South Welshmen did very little in response, just kept on going about their lives. And so there was a couple of fines handed out. And yet still, somehow, there were protests in New South Wales about these incredibly minor, weak lockdowns, whereas in Queensland and Victoria, we had complete hard lockdowns across southeast Queensland and the Melbourne metropolitan areas. People weren't allowed out of their houses unless you were an essential worker. Everything went online. There was required masks, and businesses were shut down. The city, the CBD, turned into a complete ghost town for Melbourne and Brisbane for months there, and again during the snap lockdowns. And Brisbane being a bit of a big country town in some ways, a lot of Queensland being fairly rural, agriculture and mining, sparsely populated, but Victoria with a very dense population centre in Melbourne and related urban population centres had a lot more social impetus there, and they had massive protests recently against these huge lockdowns that the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has had to institute to try and get this under control. And for the most part, the lockdowns have been wildly successful. There was the daily case numbers have been publicly released along with various other open data initiatives by Victoria Health, and analysis by various independent researchers from other states have shown that the lockdowns were extremely effective in reducing case spread almost instantly. There was a massive drop in case spread just from these lockdowns. And similarly, there was research to support that masks and vaccines were also effective at slowing or stopping the rate of COVID spread. And yet there's still been massive protests just in the last week. I think the first one was a little over a week and a half ago. There's something like thousands of people. I think the number was either 7,000 or 10,000, a couple of different estimates being thrown around, hit the streets to complain about these lockdowns and saying we want to go back to work. And the impetus for this one was the shutdown of construction sites. And the trade unions here in Australia are heavily unionized, and the construction industry itself has one of the strongest, most militant unions in Australia. I'm talking here about the infamous CMFEU, the Construction, Mining, Forestry, Education Union. Sorry, not education, energy union, the construction and heavy industry related trades, as the most militant. And so they've been regularly targeted by conservatives with legislation specifically to bust unions or weaken their power. And yet the CMFEU have still carried on regardless with industrial action fighting for workers' rights to a degree which has made them controversial even among the left. And so coming out of this, we've seen not an official involvement by the CMFEU, but a huge amount of that organisation and mobilisation has been turned towards protesting these lockdowns in Victoria and in Melbourne. And in almost a day, less than a day, 12 hours later after these protests, there was joint press releases from multiple unions, including the Victorian College of Trade Unions, the Australian College of, the Victorian Trades Hall, and the Australian College of Trade Unions, denouncing these protests and saying that they were not supported by the Australian union movement. And the CMFEU itself was officially not involved. And what happened was this massive protest turned pretty nasty pretty quickly. And if anyone had any doubts about whether the protest was union organized and union instigated, well, it somehow eventually ended up outside the CMFEU offices in Melbourne, and there was a fist fight as union officials stood staunch in front of their union office in defiance of these protesters who attempted to break in, actively assaulting union officials. And when these union members, led by Secretary John Sepka from the CMFEU, were forced to retreat inside by the weight of the crowd attempted to actively besiege their office in almost a mirror of what happened in the Biden's inauguration day in the U.S. when the always Trump movement attempted to besiege the White House on a much smaller scale, maybe, but a similar massive crowd trying to break in. We were watching this remotely, and it was kind of scary. And so we've seen left wing commenters all around the world, but especially in Australia, suddenly terrified by what, for some intents and purposes, may actually be bottom unity in terms of the four-axis political compass, where left libertarians and right libertarians, or at least some factions from those quadrants, the green quadrant and the yellow quadrant, are starting to unite in opposition to state and government-based crackdowns on these protests. And since that large Melbourne protest, there's been several follow-ups, and the police response to that has been incredibly strict. And so we've seen a gradual ramp up of police powers over the last probably 6 to 8 years. We do have a massive massive culture in Australia of grassroots organisation, of protest, and of major people-based action. We have the strongest union movement in the world. During the Iraq wars in the early 2000s, we had rallies of millions of people in the major cities turning up to protest John Howard's decision to follow Tony Blair and George Bush into Iraq. Millions of people turned out to protest that. But what happened in response to those 2001 protests against the war? They were ignored. John Howard ignored millions of people turning up to say, this is a deal breaker for us. You've got to turn us around. And he followed the lead of the US into Iraq, into a war which we didn't need and turned out to be based on a lie anyway, a lie in pursuit of oil. And so that moment kind of broke the spirit of Australian protest culture for years afterwards, where we realized that our government doesn't care about us. Our government has their own plans and their own ideas, and they won't listen to the people, and they haven't listened to the people for decades. And we saw that with Labor when they got in after Howard was kicked out. Howard was enormously popular in his time. He made a lot of promises which got him into government. He was an effective political operator and managed to unite a lot of disparate factions, but he turned around and betrayed those campaign promises. And he did a lot of very questionable policy decisions, which in his later years, he's come to criticize successive conservative governments. And now we can see the ALP following almost in lockstep behind the Liberal National Party in many ways, letting the Conservatives set the lead for policy. And that includes a massive anti-protest impetus, where they are cracking down on protests in a way which is absolutely in breach of civil liberties. We've seen this in Melbourne, in Victoria, under the state Labor government there. We've seen it in Queensland, here in Brisbane, under the state Labor government here. And it's just ironic that in New South Wales, under a Liberal government, that there has been very weak protests because they've had very weak leadership. In fact, almost no leadership at all. Despite preferential treatment from the federal government, the state New South Wales Liberal government has taken no action, very weak lockdowns to no lockdowns at all, to try and address the COVID outbreak. And in response, there has been an enormous COVID outbreak across the extended greater Sydney metropolitan region. And so I'm on a bit of a high horse here, railing against Australian Labor, but I think they can do better, and I think they should do better. To start being supposedly a pro-union movement and a left-wing movement, and yet here they have failed to support freedom of speech and free expression and free association by supporting and enabling public action. And even though there is a massive risk from these protests in exacerbating the COVID outbreak, there is a massive risk in promoting anti-science beliefs. And many of these anti-lockdown protests have been filled with anti-maskers and anti-vacciners, and we've seen a lot of that in journalists who are covering these protests. Unfortunately, that's one of the prices of free speech, that that dangerous ideas exist and we can't shut them down just because some of them might be inconvenient. In response to the Extinction Rebellion protests here in Brisbane 2 years ago and last year, the Queensland Police brought their first ever mounted troopers in, and they brought in specialist army units and anti-protest consultants from the other states in order to try and shut down Extinction Rebellion. Similarly, in New South Wales and Victoria, we've seen an increasing militarization, and part of this has also been prompted by, ironically, American policy, where with the G20 hosted in Brisbane back in 2012 or 2013, there was a 24/7 armed response team equipped like a special operations unit with bulletproof armor and assault weapons in a bulletproof van, driving around Brisbane constantly on ready on call to respond to any active shooter incident due to the G20. And that was, sorry, I tell a lie, it would have been earlier because I remember, I believe Obama was visiting as well. So it would have been back towards the end of his term. And so similarly, the Commonwealth Games, again hosted in the Gold Coast here in Queensland, we saw a massive military response. And yet, what were the protesters? There was the only protesters and the only potential disruption to the Commonwealth Games was First Nations activists who've been complaining about colonialism and our close ties to the UK. And they wanted to make that known and make their displeasure known at the mild inconvenience of genocide that they've been experiencing at the hand of British colonialists for the last couple of centuries. And yet the police saw fit to deploy enormous reserves of militarized force to try and shut them down, many arrests and many criminal charges. So I don't want to characterize this as being a strongly left or right-leaning issue with the response to COVID, but you can see political breakdowns in there. You can see biased approaches in the media and in journalists and how they cover certain aspects of it. So I hope that's given a bit of an overview for our American viewers and given you a bit of an idea, Mitch, of what the situation is like here with COVID and with these protests, because there is a lot going on, and it is very easy to misrepresent or misunderstand it if you're not on the ground and seeing and hearing what people are saying about it.
And I'm glad you clarified because, as I've said to you before, the media in the States has really done a phenomenal job of painting the protests and the use of force against protesters in Australia as a hellscape where you're losing civil liberties at a massive rate. And
it's absolutely
I think
true.
I'm
but
glad.
It's not because of the protests.
Hey.
And this is something which we've been campaigning about hugely, and I don't want to sort of steal your thunder, and yes, there's been problems with the protests, but what people aren't realizing, what these conservative commenters aren't realizing, and what even a lot of like right libertarians aren't realizing is that yes, there has been a crackdown on civil liberties. There has been a loss of our rights to privacy and rights to free expression and right to transparent and open government. It's been happening for years, but it's been happening under a liberal national government with support from Labor in many instances. Over about nearly a decade, over a decade and a half, almost starting back in the Howard years with the counterterrorism laws being brought in. And what are these laws for? It's always the same thing. Against this bogeyman of counterterrorism, we have to go and fight those terrorists who apparently have a enormous army hidden away in the suburbs of Ballarat and Newtown and Sydney somehow. So we have to have military, the police have to have military equipment to deal with that somehow. And at the same time, we also need to crack down on those nasty pedophiles who are corrupting our youth and running enormous trafficking rings all throughout Australia, and with links to organised crime. And yet somehow the police don't have the powers to address these already, and so as a result, they need to actively spy on all of our citizens. And so we've seen bills like the Identify and Disrupt bill most recently being passed, which actually give police the power to, without a warrant in some cases, the power to impersonate people online, to edit data on their devices, to add or delete data on their devices. And so, we, one of the members of the Pirate Party had this pretty funny observation that we've been asking for an edit button on Twitter for years, but we don't want. This is not the kind of edit button we wanted. We don't want ASIO and the Australian Federal Police going in and editing our posts for us. And similarly, a few years ago, there was the Assistance and Access Bill, which gave the federal police and the alphabet agencies over here the power to compel tech companies to assist them, to force tech companies to assist them in introducing vulnerabilities into their own platforms. It was called a technical assistance notice or technical capabilities notice, where police officers could go to an ISP and say, well, you have to create a backdoor in your own systems so that we can hack into our own citizens here in Australia. And the entire tech industry went into an uproar and said, this is going to kill all trust in Australian services, both here and overseas. And similarly, there was the gag order provisions, which you're probably very familiar with in America, where if an Australian company or an Australian worker received one of these technical assistance notices, where they'd be required to implement a backdoor of a vulnerability, deliberate vulnerability into their own software, which could be used by any kind of bad actor, they couldn't tell anyone about it. There's no canary here. There's no dead canary here we can show off. There's no whistleblowers here who can come in and save us. They will be punished by criminal laws, by counter-terrorism laws for carrying out and doing that. And the scariest thing was that this would apply to Australian workers for international companies and overseas. So suddenly the Australian tech industry became an enormous privacy liability. And due to regulations such as GDPR in Europe, it becomes a legal liability for European tech companies to hire Australian talent. And so, in one move, the completely tech illiterate and incompetent conservative and neoliberal government of Australia managed to once again torpedo our fledgling tech industry, which has been struggling ever since the GFC, where yet again there was the loss of a lot of local companies, and there was a complete failure to support them from the federal government. So there's a bit of a trend here where the government doesn't understand technology. They don't understand the own economy they claim to be good economic managers for. And so in the process, inadvertently hamstring it in all sort of ways, similar to the ridiculous handling of the French deal by this current conservative government, the backflips there. I'm sure you've got some horror stories to tell us from the US about similar legislation like the PRISM Act. Or the prison program, rather.
One sec.
So for those who are following along at home, the Prison Project was, we found about it through the Snowden leaks and WikiLeaks. It was a program set up by the NSA back in approximately, I want to say 2006, to create a tap on the entire internet. All mainland communications coming out of the US along the internet were diverted like a light beam through a prism, split off into two streams. One stream went on to the rest of the world, and the other stream was stored into a massive NSA data center for them to peruse over at their will, looking through all communications coming into or out of the US. What is this incredible overreach? Who thought that was justified?
So I do apologize. I actually was not aware of the name Prism for the leaks. The Snowden leaks are well documented over here, but the for some reason I don't know why the name Prism. This is the first at least I've heard of the name. But yeah, the scary thing with the Snowden leaks, and just the idea that we find out that that our government is not only spying on us but keeping tabs on us. You know, it's that nothing really came of it. Is that we found out all this information, and immediately the fingers were pointed at Snowden. Snowden's a bad guy. Look what he's doing. And it got to the point where I had when I was at community college, a Illinois congressman by the name of Michael Quigley came in to talk to our political science class, and I had asked him a question about Snowden, and he like started stuttering, backed off, and he goes, "He's in Moscow right now. There's a reason for that." So it was very much the United States is probably the most propagandized country in the world. And anytime they want a narrative to be pushed on the general public, I typically believe that they're successful. So the fact that these Snowden leaks were made to be not that big of a deal, uh, it's probably the scariest thing to me is that there was not bigger outrage, that the public, it almost became like, oh great, now they're spying on us too. Like it wasn't like this, like suddenly like, oh, my liberties are being encroached, like the response you're seeing with a lot of these conservatives when it talks about wearing a mask or these vaccine mandates. You didn't see that when we found out the government was quite literally spying on us. And I do believe that it was the mastercraft of the United States playing damage control.
Propaganda is a huge problem where we have seemingly legitimate or reputable news organizations pushing for-profit advertising as entertainment, paid for by various for-profit interests to promote their own products and services, to promote specific political gain, or to promote their own chosen agenda. And to right-wing conservatives, this is a legitimate function of the media that they should be allowed to pursue this propagandizing purpose, whether for private, commercial, corporate gain, or for public state-based propaganda, like in the US, and the endless support of the US wars overseas. Noam Chomsky has written about this quite a lot with his famous book Manufacturing Consent, about how the US media and similarly in the UK and Australia, but from his perspective, the US media would operate in lockstep with the US government. Even the supposedly opposition media, whether left wing with a right wing government or right wing media with a left wing government, would still serve to fulfill their ultimate strategic goals internally and in terms of foreign policy, and how they'd support those centers of power, and they'd lock out alternative media who attempted to meaningfully criticize or otherwise be skeptical of government policy. And here in Australia too, it's just as much the same, where even the supposedly alternative or opposition based media still side with the government or side with the opposition more often than not. And the opposition here in Australia, being opposition in name only, they do tend to support the government and align with the government more often than not, rather than proposing actual meaningful change. When people ask me what's the difference between the Liberal Party, the Liberal National Party of Australia, and the Australian Labor Party, the way I summarise it is that, well, the ALP want a little bit more spending on health and education, and maybe they'd like a little bit less racism in the country, and that's about it. In many ways, it seems fairly superfluous, and I'll throw in there as well. Sorry, the Labor Party does want slightly better outcomes on climate change and environmental protection, which should be mentioned, as compared to the Liberal Party. But even now, times are changing. In the lyrics of the famous song, even though the actions of government cast this massive dark shadow with the military bases, the militarization of the police, the loss of civil liberties, the erosion of civil liberties with spying on our own citizens, even so, Fairfax Media has come out in support of climate change action, and the Liberal Party is increasingly pressured to take action on climate change, with only a very minority hard right conservative faction predominantly within the Nationals, who are opposing action against climate change, and they're holding the rest of the LNP coalition to ransom over this, when even Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who famously brought in a lump of coal to Parliament several years ago, declaring that it was nothing to be afraid of, and to be the object of much ridicule from both sides of Parliament, his apparent worship and love of this lump of coal, himself, of course, being an evangelical Christian. I think in his mind, he somehow conflated his magic sky ferry with the coal deep underground. Like money and religion and Christian religion seem to go together quite a lot here in Australia, and probably similarly in America as well. So what can we do about it?
It's actually very funny you mentioned it. There was a political YouTuber by the name of Second Thought who had just released a video on religion and conservatism, specifically in the United States, but based on what I'm taking in, especially when you mentioned evangelical Christian. I assume that the situation isn't far removed from the situation that we face in the States. The I always found that so interesting that the hardcore religious fanatics tend to be the conservatives. I was raised Catholic, uh, and for me, because I'm Catholic, that's I was taught treat everyone equally, uh, feed the poor, house the needy, clothe the sick, and it just seems that's such an interesting dichotomy to me. But I actually do not believe that was your question that you were trying to ask. I apologize.
So Scott Morrison, for those who don't know, is a fairly, I want to say, subtle in his support and attendance at the Hillsong Church, the massive televangelical institution who have enormous mega churches all over Australia, and I believe started in America actually, and is the home of very famous preaching pastors who incorporate massive song and dance, a literal performance in their acts, all geared towards the raising of money, millions of dollars in funds and donations, largely which goes into their own pockets or creating these enormous, massive festivals of worship. It's a huge problem in Australia where there have been campaigns to get some kind of secular approach towards this, where we can close those tax loopholes for these enormous religious organizations who have enormous land assets and huge amounts of income from donations, and yet manage to get away with paying no taxes, and in some cases award themselves ridiculous salaries for it as well. Similarly, religious schools in Australia are given tax breaks and tax subsidies, are given educational support, despite their active religious advocacy and proselytizing. The school chaplains program, which has been earmarked for funding intended for counseling for children, mental health and support counseling, a large portion of which goes towards the chaplaincy program. And yet, when a young person goes into the chaplain's office to say, "I think I might be the wrong gender," or I think I might be attracted to the same gender," and what's the chaplain's response? Well, that's a sin, or I don't know how to deal with that. You'll have to just try and repress it. Well, that's how you get to enormous crushing mental health problems, which go through the rest of life. That's how you get youth suicides, and yet this is the conservatives' response to this idea that government should not be beholden to special interest groups above all else, should not be beholden to religion. When our prime minister himself, is an active adherent of this conservative doomsday cult, where Hillsong adherents do actively preach that we're heading towards the rapture, the end of the world, and we should be prepared for that. This is what our prime minister believes. And so suddenly his not inaction on climate change, his support of brinkmanship with China, his attempt to divert enormous amounts of funding towards his mates in the coal industry and the development industry suddenly starts to make sense. Where this incredibly self-destructive approach towards government and society suddenly starts to make sense. I'm aware we're running pretty close to time here, so let's kind of bring it home, and tell me a little bit more about yourself. You're running for the Illinois congressional district. What's your campaign on?
So for the Illinois spot, when I initially had decided to run, there was a incredibly conservative Democrat by the name of Dan Lipinski who held this spot since 2005. And before him was a man by the name of Bill Lipinski, his father, who was in the position from like 93 to 2005. And they were very conservative Democrats, which a conservative Democrat is just a moderate Republican. So we saw while a blue seat, a lot of conservative issues remain true. So I kind of pushed myself towards running with the expectation of I was going to be running against Dan Lipinski. Unfortunately, Dan Lipinski lost last election cycle to a far more progressive candidate by the name of Marie Newman. Marie's fine. Marie is a wonderful candidate, but I do believe she is still corporate backed, and I do believe she's still beholden to the major two parties. Just she's the Democrat. So for me, I'm running just because I think that the two party duopoly has held on too long in this country, that there's certain issues that cannot be ignored that get ignored because the two parties tend to agree on it. One of the major things has been United States military bases, which we have well over 100 military bases. I couldn't tell you the exact number overseas, and our military spending in this country. You said earlier China is a second place to the United States, but it can't be understated that we can cut ours in half, and we're still beating China, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars here. You know, I would love to cut military spending in this country. We don't have universal health care. We do not have universal education. There are things that these are things Marie Newman ran on that because the Democratic Party doesn't want to actually push these through, I haven't heard her mention Medicare for all once. Which makes me think that no matter how good the message is, and you've seen that with politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where even if her messaging is good, as long as you're seeing the Republicans and the Democrats, you're going to see status quo and you're going to see business as usual. The Pirate Party made me feel like I had a platform to run as a real person, where I am a working class representative, that I'm a member of I work, I get a paycheck like most Americans do. I don't think I'm the most qualified. In fact, I'm probably woefully underqualified. But I don't remember there being a list of qualifications to run for representative. Last I heard, it was meant to be a position representative of the people in Congress. And I hope to be able to bring that aspect back. I know my chances are slim, but my chances are slimmer if I don't try. And I think that I have as good a chance as any for anyone who wants to run for office, which I think everyone should. I think every single person should run for some type of office at some point in their life. Politics is too important to just say, "Oh, I don't care about politics." That's not a good excuse. That's not a good answer.
Absolutely. And here in Australia, we've averaged about 1 to 2% of the vote for the upper house elections we've ran for, and that's not enough to get elected. It's not enough to earn a quota for a seat, but it is enough to make a statement and send a message that we do exist. We do have politics we advocate for. We do believe we have a place in the political spectrum. And when we see bills like the spying bills, like the counterterrorism bills, like the crackdown on civil liberties, the complete disregard for technology and science and evidence-based policies, there's the need for transparency in government, need for direct democracy and fair representation. We know that pirate politics always has a place and always will have a place in some form or another. Thank you very much, Mitch Davilo, swarmcare manager, Pirate Party US, and Illinois congressional candidate. Good luck in your campaign, and I hope this is the start of something new and exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I hope to continue to have more talks with the Australian Pirate Party. Miles, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You have a great night.